Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Rebecca, otherwise known as Hypnot Hooray Online, and this is podcast episode 20. So in this podcast episode, I have two finished objects to share, including this sweater that I'm wearing today. I have updates on a few of my whips, two new cast-ons, and I wanted to chat about some future plans because I was hoping to get some of your input on some frogged yarn that I have. So I'll just get into the first finished object, which is the one that I'm wearing, which is my Clematis Sweater by Emma's Knits. So this sweater, I had 3 different deadlines for myself. I wanted this to be my holiday Christmas sweater, but I hadn't cast it on at that point. Then I wanted this to be my Lunar New Year sweater, and I didn't finish it by the end of January. And so I set a 3rd deadline for myself to finish it by Valentine's Day. And I managed to finish it. I did need to use a blow dryer to speed up the drying process so I could sew on the buttons on Valentine's Day, but we managed to finish it in time, and I'm really happy with the finished object. I know it's a cliche or like kind of typical that you would say that your latest finished object may be your favorite garment of all time, but this honestly may be in the top 3, maybe my favorite garment that I ever knit. I just love the color, I love the diagonal button band, I love the fit of the sweater, just everything. I'm really happy with it. So I'll chat now about the modifications that I made to the sweater. So the first is I ended up cropping the sweater, which I think if you watched any of my previous podcast episodes, that would come at no surprise because I always crop a lot of my sweaters or tops. So I'll maybe stand up so you could kind of see where it fits. So this is kind of how I like to wear the Clematis sweater, like partially buttoned at the top and then unbuttoned at the bottom. And it fits a little bit more cropped, but still, I would say, covers most of my torso. And so I cropped the sweater by about 9 centimeters, and I'm happy with the length, but if I were to knit this again, because I knew I was going to crop it from the beginning, if I were to knit this again, I would change the repeat right here. So the diagonal button band is achieved with increases and decreases, and it's a 4-row repeat. I think if I were to do it again, I would change it to maybe a 3-row repeat, just so the diagonal band is a little bit more steep and it would hit closer to the other side of my torso. I don't think it looks bad necessarily. I just think that because I cropped it, the diagonal button band kind of ends like closer to the middle of my torso here. And I think I would have liked it if it ended closer to the other side, which is, I think, how the pattern is intended to fit. So that's just one minor thing that I would change about this. Another modification that I made is I made the sleeves more fitted than what the pattern calls for. So I picked up 10 fewer stitches around the armhole here before working the short rows. And one thing that I never really noticed about the Clematis sweater is that the sleeves are quite relaxed. I think because I was always so focused on the button band, I didn't really look at how the sleeves were fitted, and I prefer the look of a more fitted sleeve, especially because this sweater has I would say less positive ease than previous sweaters that I've knit. I think it's around 5 to 7 centimeters of positive ease is suggested in the pattern, and so because the body is a little bit more fitted, I wanted the sleeves to also be more fitted. And I don't think that they're super tight or anything. They're pretty relaxed, and I'm really happy with that. So I just picked up 10 fewer stitches, but then kept the decrease rate that is specified in the pattern as I worked the sleeves. And then the last modification that I made to the sweater has to do with my knitting kryptonite, which is working 1x1 rib flat. I really don't like the look of a wonky 1x1 rib. It really bothers me, and so I always try different methods, or I just change the ribbing technique to maybe like twisted rib or 2x2 rib whenever I see it looks really wonky, just because I really don't like the look. With this sweater, I didn't really want to change that because that would also impact how I would work the button band. So I tried out some different techniques to get the 1x1 rib to look a little bit more even, worked flat. So the first thing is I worked it according to the pattern once on the body, and it was just really messy. It didn't really look very great. And so I frogged that back, and then I posted a poll on my Instagram asking for some suggestions, and a lot of people said to size down the needle size quite a bit, but I was a little bit worried that that would create a more cinched in 1x1 rib, which I didn't really want for this sweater. So what I did was I actually on the last round of stockinette before switching to the 1x1 rib for the body hem here, I worked increases. I worked make one lefts 6 times. I think it was like every 32 stitches. I'll leave the notes in my Ravelry, but I just added a few more stitches to the body before I worked the 1x1 rib to kind of counteract how much it would cinch in, because I sized down to 3mm needles. This pattern is worked on, I feel like I didn't mention it, but it's intended to work on 4.5mm needles. I sized down to 4mm needles because I knew with this yarn that it was going to grow quite a bit with blocking. So I went from 4mm needles to 3mm needles for the hems. So sizing down 2 full needle sizes, which I think really helped. I knew that the DK and Mohair was going to be quite tight on 3mm needles, so yeah, that's why I worked the increases, and I think that helped quite a bit the second time around, but it still looked pretty uneven. And Millie of What Millie Is Making sent me a technique called dry blocking. I'll link the video that she sent me down below because I thought it was so helpful. I had, I guess, done dry blocking before without really knowing what dry blocking is, which is trying to manually adjust your stitches before wet blocking to get the stitches to sit more evenly. So the way that I had done, I guess, dry blocking before was always adjusting the knit stitch of a 1x1 rib. So when I work 1x1 rib, I find that the knit columns are always a bit wonky, like because you're working it one direction, it will lean that way, and then when you work back and it's your purl stitch, I find that they lean the other direction. And whenever I did the dry blocking, I would just try to manually adjust those knit stitches so they would be less wonky and sit more straight. But in the video that Millie had sent me, the dry blocking involved pulling the purl stitch in between the knit columns, and that was such a game changer. It was a lot more, I think, effective at getting the 1x1 rib to look a little bit more even. I'm looking at it now and it's still not perfect. It still bothers me a little bit, but those two modifications together, or those two techniques, I guess, sizing down 2 full needle sizes and doing the dry blocking with the purl stitches really helped. I did try combination knitting actually for the 1x1 rib of this sweater, but it just didn't work that well for me. It's never really worked that well. So combination knitting is where you wrap either your purl stitch or your knit stitch backwards. So you wrap the yarn clockwise around the needle, and then as you're working the row back, you have to knit through the back loop in order to not twist the stitch. So a lot of people suggest combination knitting, and I do think it works because a lot of people suggested it to me, but it's never really worked for me. And when I tried it with this 1x1 rib, it still looked pretty wonky. I might try to do combination knitting in the future where I wrap the knit stitch maybe backwards instead of the purl stitch is what I usually do, and maybe that will help a little bit more. But yeah, some experimentation for the 1x1 rib to make it look really even, and I'm really happy that I took the time to try out all those techniques because the button band here I think is a pretty central part of the design, and I wanted it to look very even and neat, and I think that I did the best that I could to get the button band to look nice and the 1x1 rib to look very clean. So those are the modifications that I made. In terms of how I feel about the pattern, this isn't the first pattern that I've knit from Emma of Emma's Knits, so I kind of knew what to expect. I knew I was going to enjoy the pattern writing. It's very clear and concise, but not to a point where you're missing details. I will say that there isn't any video tutorials in this pattern, and it is a pretty straightforward construction, but there are some parts of the pattern where I hadn't really done that technique or process before, like for example picking up the left front here. you have to pick up the stitches in a different way than how you would normally pick up stitches at a seam. And also at the end, once you pick up stitches along the diagonal button band here, maybe I can undo the sweater to kind of show you. You have to pick up stitches along the right front here and then along the left front here to work the button band. And once you work that button band, it's kind of like a loose flap here, so you need to sew that down along the shoulder seam here. So the hopefully me unbuttoning this kind of showed you a little bit better, but yes, you have to sew it down here. And the pattern explains that you need to do that, but there's no video or photo guide kind of showing you how to sew it down. I do think though that it's still pretty straightforward. I didn't have any trouble with it. But if you maybe haven't knit a lot of sweaters before and you prefer the video tutorial to show you, you won't have that for this pattern. You'll just have to figure it out, but it's not complicated or anything, but just something to keep in mind if you like video tutorials for techniques. And then the other thing about this sweater is there is no short row shaping or any sort of shaping along the back here. So maybe I'll turn to the side. I kind of like wearing my finished objects while chatting about them. I don't usually do that, but I think it's helpful to show. So basically right here, there's no short rows or increases or anything like that to get a more trapezoidal shape along the back. It's just a rectangle that you knit flat. So when you start by casting on the back, you just are knitting just straight down, and then you pick up stitches from there to work the increases for the left and the right front. And at first when I finished this sweater and I was just looking at the sweater, it was really stiff because I hadn't blocked it yet. And so the shoulder seam here just looked a little bit awkward, and I was a little bit worried on how the sweater would fit because at that point I hadn't added the buttons here to close it. So I wasn't really sure how this sweater was going to turn out yet. It looks really different before and after blocking and adding all the finishing. So I kind of thought that the lack of shaping at the back would kind of impact the fit, but it's very comfortable. I honestly don't really notice it. Maybe it would have made the sweater a little bit more comfortable, but I don't think it creates like a rippling here, which is what you get sometimes without any short rows. So I don't think there's any issues with that. Emma did comment on one of my posts saying that the lack of short row shaping here was intentional because she wanted to make the pattern a little bit more accessible to beginners. And I do agree with that. I think that that makes the pattern a little bit easier to follow. There is short rows in the pattern for the sleeves here. When you pick up the sleeve stitches, you do some short rows to do like a little mini sleeve cap. But I think if this is one of your first sweater patterns, by the time you get to the sleeves, I would say, I think you're ready to look up how to do short rows. So I do think that that makes the sweater a little bit more accessible and beginner friendly. And I think most of the time when a sweater doesn't have short rows, it's kind of a con and it impacts the fit. But in this case, I wouldn't say that's the case. I do really like how the sweater fits. And then the last thing I want to touch on is my thoughts on the yarn. So I've used Cozy Wool Merino several times before in previous projects, and this isn't the first time that I've used Cozy Wool Merino and Drops Kid Silk held together. So I do really like this yarn combination. I think it's a really nice, affordable combination, and I do have mixed feelings about the Drops Kid Silk. So the Cozy Wool Merino, or the Luxe Merino that it's now rebranded to, is just a classic go-to for me if I want a more affordable, pretty tight, smooth, soft merino yarn. It does have acrylic in it, so if that's a deal breaker for you, you probably won't like this yarn, but I do really like how this yarn feels. After blocking, it's very smooth and the stitches are always very even. The one unfortunate thing about working with this color of the Cozy Wool Merino, and this is not something that's happened with any of the other shades that I've worked with in the past, like even the navy or the black, this yarn, and I think it's this instead of the Mohair, this stained my wooden knitting needles. So my wooden knitting needles that I used to work this project are now pink at the tips, and also when I blocked this sweater, the color bled a lot. Like the yarn, or sorry, the water was like bright red when I blocked it, and I don't necessarily think that that is a big issue. I was just thinking something to keep in mind for color work in the future. But I do think when I posted this on my stories, people had helpfully suggested that if you put some vinegar in the water before you put your finished object in, when you're blocking, or if you put in a color catcher in the water, that should help with the color bleeding. But yeah, this color of the Cozy Wool Merino does stain and bleed a little bit. And then the Drops Kid Silk, I have mixed feelings about. I do really like Drops Kid Silk as an affordable option for mohair, but it is a little bit scratchy. It's not the scratchiest of Drops Kid Silk that I've worked with in the past. There are two others that I'm thinking. I think the shades are Moonshine and Cobalt. Those, at least those dye lots that I got, were really, really scratchy, and I cannot wear them next to skin. This one I can still wear next to skin. I do think that I'll always have a layer on underneath because I do like wearing the sweater partially open like this. But it isn't the softest yarn on the market, but it is pretty affordable. I got this from Wool Warehouse back in 2021, I think, when they were on sale. So they were only maybe a few dollars, maybe like $5 or $6. So all in all, this project was pretty affordable to knit, and I really love the color. So really happy with this finished object. I would highly recommend the pattern, and I do think that I will knit another one in the future, maybe one that's not as cropped like this, and a black one potentially. So yes, really happy with this first finished object. And then the second finished object that I have, I am equally happy about because it was a long-term whip that I had going on. It's my Jenny Jacket V-neck by Petite Knit. So the Jenny Jacket is a top-down, all-over textured smock stitch jacket, and it's knit with fingering and lace weight yarn on 4mm needles. So this was a year-long knit-along that I had with some of my knitting friends. It was called our January knit along because we were knitting Jenny series designs in January 2024, and with a goal to finish it by January 2025. So I finished this on January 31st, I want to say. Like the last day of January is when I sewed on the buttons here. I used two Knit Picks yarns for the Jenny Jacket. I used Knit Picks palette in the shade Finley Heather, and then Knit Picks Aloft in the shade Plover. And then, the buttons that I used, I forgot to mention, they're the same buttons actually as in my Clematis sweater here. So these are some plastic tortoise buttons. I got them on clearance at Michael's maybe 2 years ago. They're 16mm plastic tortoise buttons. It comes in a pack of 6, and they were on clearance for 50 cents. So I bought a few of them so I could have them for a few projects because I do like the look of them. So yeah, those are all the materials that I used for this Jenny Jacket, and I knit the size extra small. And this was a very long-term whip. I think it's been in the podcast since May or June of last year, and I'm really, really happy with how it turned out. I made a few modifications to the pattern. So like I mentioned, it's top down, it's drop shoulder, and then it's a V-neck with a double knit button band along the front. And I pretty much followed this almost to pattern. It was a very textured knit, and it was really time consuming. It wasn't necessarily complicated, but I did like everything about the pattern, so there wasn't a lot that I wanted to really change. So the first modification is I did crop the body by about 5 centimeters from what the pattern suggests before working the 1x1 rib. And then the one other modification that I did is I added some more smock stitches to the sleeves. So this is probably the most detailed Petite knit pattern that I've ever followed. And I think that also has to do with it being a textured knit. Most of the Petite knit designs that I've knit are just a very simple stockinette. So I do think that there is only so much you really need to say in the instructions of those patterns. But this pattern is super, super detailed. I'm not too sure about the other Jenny series, but basically the smock stitch here for parts of the pattern are written out row by row. So for example, for the sleeves here, I think all like 70 or 80 rounds are written out row by row, and that's because you're decreasing for the sleeve stitch here in rib or in smock stitch. So I think Petite Knit just really wants to lay out exactly how to do that while maintaining the smock stitch pattern. But I didn't really like how the smock stitch pattern was written for the sleeves here, because there would be large sections here as you're decreasing of just 2x2 rib and you wouldn't do a smock stitch. And I just thought that that looked a little bit obvious that the stitch pattern wasn't being maintained. So I added some random smock stitches, and it's not perfect. Like, these are ones that I added here where they're like a little bit smaller, or there's one that's like pretty big in the middle here. So it's not exactly perfect, but I do think that it's less noticeable than just leaving this in 1x1 rib. So I will put a picture on my Ravelry of what this looks like here if you wanted to follow that. You can always add it after the fact too by just using some scrap yarn and then creating the smock by tying it on the inside and then weaving in those ends. But I think it's easier to do it as you work it as well. So I'll put that picture on my Ravelry. So those are the two modifications that I made. I really liked the pattern. As I mentioned, I love the finishing of the Jenny jacket. The button band here is genius, the way that it's constructed. You are able to work the buttonholes here without breaking the yarn, and that's a technique that you can apply to basically all other double knit button bands that you knit. So there's a tutorial from Kimmy Monkholm on YouTube to knit that. I really like the long 1x1 rib details here, and yeah, I'm really happy with it. There are a few things I think to keep in mind with this pattern. So the first is the smock stitch with blocking grows a lot in width, but not necessarily in length. So I was really hoping that it was gonna grow in width when I finished this project, because once I tried it on, I thought it was kind of fitted and I didn't really like the look of it, especially along the sleeves here. So I didn't really have to block it that aggressively. Like, the smock stitch did just relax a lot and stretch out widthwise just naturally. I think maybe it's just the construction of the stitch. I didn't have to block it out that much, but yeah, it grew a lot widthwise, but not necessarily in length. So the length that you knit this jacket to, unless maybe you use superwash yarn, is going to be the length that it ends up being. So just keep that in mind. And then the other thing to keep in mind is the sleeve length. So I can only really speak to the size that I knit, which is size extra small, but I knit the sleeve, I think, even 2 centimeters longer than what the pattern suggests before working the 1x1 rib. And the sleeves are a little shorter than what I would have liked. So I'm kind of debating going in and just undoing the ribbing here and extending the smock stitch by maybe about 5 centimeters. I like to have my sleeves hit like mid palm. So these are just a little bit too short for my liking, especially for such a relaxed sleeve like this. I kind of like when it's a little bit longer, it's a little bit more cozy. So yeah, I think that the pattern instructions for the sleeve length is a little bit short, so I would consider extending that if you like a more cozy, longer sleeve. But other than that, I think that it's a really well written pattern. It's extremely detailed, which I really appreciated and I thought was really helpful to guide you as you work the smock stitch with shaping. And then in terms of the yarn, this was my first time working with Knit Picks palette, but I've used Knit Picks Aloft in the past before. Knit Picks Aloft is one of my favorite mohairs that I've ever worked with. I think I mention it a lot here on the podcast. But it's a really great affordable yarn, and if you can get it on sale, I think I got this shade here for I think $7 US or around $10 Canadian. And then this was the first time that I was working with Knit Picks palette, which is a 100% Peruvian Highland wool, and I would definitely use Knit Picks palette again. There is an incredible shade range. I don't really like how the colors on the Knit Picks website I think aren't the most accurate. So whenever I try to buy Knit Picks yarns, I always go on Ravelry and search up the yarn and then go into the stash photos to see what the yarn looks like. I think it's a little bit more true to color on Ravelry. So that's like the one con I would say about this yarn. And I also think because this is a pretty loosely plied 2-ply yarn, I don't know how exactly it would look in stockinette. I think it's great for more textured stitches like the smock stitch or cables. It's a very bouncy and lofty fingering weight yarn. It's a lot more lofty than like Knitting for Olive, Merino, or Sandisgarn Sunday. So I think for these textured stitches, it really fills in the gaps. And I think that the texture just really clings to itself and really helps with keeping the texture of a stitch really bouncy. But in a stockinette stitch, I don't know if the 2-ply would be a little bit too textured and not as smooth. So I don't know. I am thinking of using this yarn combination for a future project, my Yun Sweater Light. So I guess we'll test it out and I'll report back once I finish that finished object. But I do really like both of these yarns together. The yarn is 100% Peruvian Highland wool, so it's not the softest merino that you're gonna work with, but I do think that it's pretty soft and it's not really scratchy. I did hold it with Aloft though, which is a really soft and fluffy mohair. Like it really just maybe covers how scratchy the Knit Picks palette could be, but I do think that both of the yarns are really great together and I would definitely use both of these again. So those are my 2 finished objects in this podcast episode. Really happy with how those have turned out. And I will move on to my whips now. So my first whip that I have to share is my Peacock Cardigan. I've made, I think, a decent amount of progress on this cardigan, but I do feel a little bit stuck with how I want the sleeves to fit. So the Peacock Cardigan is a pattern by Knit. I'm using fingering weight 100% wool called Hitsuji Chan, and it's like a natural undyed brown shade, and I'm holding it with Knitting for Olive soft silk mohair in the shade Hazel. And the pattern is a top-down circular yoke cardigan, and I almost finished knitting the body, but we'll get to that, why I haven't finished it yet, and I'm knitting the sleeves right now. So I was on track to finish the body. I was just chugging along knitting on the stockinette, but I have a new cast-on which I'll maybe chat about next. And because of that cast-on, I had to use some of this mohair for that project, so I may not have enough to create a full-length cardigan. So I kind of just stopped the body here, and I figured I would just go on to the sleeves to see how much yarn I would have in the end to finish off the body, whether or not I could keep going or whether or not I should just start working the 1x1 rib, so then I would have enough for the button band and the neckline, because I didn't work that yet, even though the pattern says that you need to cast that on first. I'm doing that at the end. So yes, I finished the body sort of. I think this is the length that I want it, but if I can add a little bit more length, I would. So that's why they're still on the needles there. And then the sleeves, I have worked in 2 different ways because I don't really know how I want this cardigan to fit. So the sleeves of this Peacock cardigan, I would say, are pretty relaxed. At least for size extra small, I think that they're pretty relaxed. You decrease every, I think it's like 15 rows or something like that. So a pretty straight sleeve. And I didn't really like how loose that was going to fit. So I ended up modifying the decrease rate to decrease every 10 rounds. And that is this sleeve here. Then I tried on the cardigan and I still felt like the sleeves were a little bit loose compared to how tight the body might fit. So I ended up, instead of ripping back, I ended up knitting this sleeve a different way and tried it on to see how I like the cardigan to fit. And I don't really know which one I like. I think I honestly might be leaning towards the slightly looser fit sleeve here, so I'm glad that I didn't rip this back, but I do really like this one as well. It's just a little bit more fitted and tight than I was kind of expecting, but I was just experimenting and I kind of did a weird decrease right here. I picked up 8 stitches at the underarm here and then I knit them all 2 together, so there's only 4 stitches picked up at the underarm here, and then I worked the decreases here at a gradual rate, I would say. So I did the decreases every 7 rows here, and then I repeated that 3 times. Then I did the decrease here every 8 rows, repeated that 3 times, and then I did the decreases here every 9 rows, and then repeated that 3 times. So it's getting gradually less and less tapered as you get to the end of the sleeve. Yeah, I don't really know. I just was experimenting and seeing how I liked how that fit. But I do think that this is a lot more fitted at my forearm than I kind of expected, even though I did change the stitch counts. I was thinking it would still be a little bit more relaxed, but it's pretty tight. So I have a decision to make. I need to figure out if I like the more fitted sleeve or if I like the more relaxed sleeve here or the more fitted sleeve here. And we're going to see which one I like before trying to also figure out how much of the body to work. So that's kind of where I'm at with my Peacock cardigan. It was a little bit of extra work for myself to do both sleeves and inevitably have to rip back one of them, but I do think that it really changes the look of how the lace cardigan looks, so I do need to decide that and then reknit one of the sleeves. So hopefully I figure that out in the next podcast episode and maybe have the neckline and the button band worked. I was originally going to work the button band here as a double knit button band, but because I may not have enough mohair anymore for this project, I may just go and do the 1x1 rib, which I don't think looks as nice, but it requires less yarn. So I may need to change my plans for that as well. So kind of in flux with this cardigan, but just trying out some new things with it. And then maybe I can now chat about the whip in question that made me not have enough mohair anymore for the Peacock cardigan. It is a very late gift knit, so before I pull it out, it is a gift knit for my boyfriend's mom, Grace. So Grace, I know you're watching this podcast, so if you are, I will put the timestamp, if I can, right here, or just skip to the next chapter because I always put the chapters in this podcast. So yes, if you're watching and you don't want to see the mittens that I'm making for you, please skip to my next whip. So these are a very late gift knit that I am making for, as I mentioned, my boyfriend's mom. She really wanted a pair of gloves, like very fine knit gloves for Christmas, and I knew that I wasn't going to finish them in time, so instead I did a little like IOU. I put some yarn in a box, some yarns that I thought that she would like, some colors that I thought she would like, and a little mood board of some mittens that I thought that she would also like, so she could maybe pick the yarn and then pick the fingerless gloves or the gloves based off of the pictures that I included in the box. And she said that she liked all of them. She liked all the colors. She liked all of the mittens that I printed out. So she just said to surprise her. So I went with a different yarn combination than what I put in the box and a different mitten pattern than what I put in the box as well. So I think she's going to be a little bit surprised, but I think she's going to really like this pattern. So these are the Cloudburst Mittens by, I am forgetting the designer's name. It's Adrienne something. Adrienne Gray. So this is a free pattern on Ravelry. I found it while I was searching for fingerless gloves in a fingering weight gauge. So it's a free pattern download, and this is where I'm at with the first mitten here. So this is knit with fingering weight yarn from the bottom up on 3mm needles, and it features this lace motif along the front of the mitten and then just stockinette at the back. And when I had started with my gauge swatching, I knew I wanted to use onling number 11 for this glove pattern because it does have a little bit of cashmere in it, so it's a little bit more luxurious. This is onling number 11 in the shade Alabama. But when I was gauge swatching on 3mm needles, I couldn't achieve gauge. Then I pulled out my trusty Addi Flexi Flips, which I really like for small circumference knitting, size 2.25, and I could sort of meet gauge, but I did think that the finished fabric wasn't going to be very warm. Like, it was still a really thin fabric, and because there's the lace motif at the top, I really wanted something to fill in some of the gaps, because I feel like these aren't going to be a very practical fingerless glove pattern if the fabric is really thin and there's like a bunch of holes along the top. I didn't think it'd be particularly warm. So I decided this color here, which I'm using for my Peacock Cardigan, knitting for Olive in the shade Hazel, matched really well with the online yarn here, and it really filled in the gaps. It's creating a pretty warm finish fabric, even though the fabric is still pretty thin, and I could still achieve gauge on 2.25 millimeter needles, so it's kind of a win-win. I'm just playing a little bit of yarn chicken now with the Peacock Cardigan, but it's okay because I am so happy with this finished fabric combination. I think it's so luxurious together. So I finished, or I almost finished, one of the gloves here. I just need to knit one more round of twisted rib along the top before I bind off and then knit the thumb. So maybe I'll try it on here. I am really enjoying how this pattern is knit. It has the twisted rib along the bottom, and then you're working the lace motif here, but then you're working stockinette on one side. It actually works really well for flexi flips, or if you're working magic loop, because you just have to worry about the lace motif on one half of the project, or on one of the needles, and then the other half is stockinette. And I'm really enjoying the lace instructions for this pattern. So the pattern has the lace repeat written out, it has it charted, and it also has the legend for the chart all on the same page, which I think is such a great part of the pattern. Great pattern writing, and now I guess the gold standard for me in future lace patterns. I think it's so important that they're all kind of on the same page, so you're not flipping between multiple pages of the pattern, trying to figure out what a stitch means in the chart, or like if you can't follow the chart, you have the written instructions right there as well. But even if that all wasn't included on one page, I do think that the lace motif is pretty intuitive and simple to work up. I feel like it's really easy to read your work with this lace repeat, and it's pretty simple. It's just like one panel here across the front. So after I worked the first one, I think I was able to memorize the rest of them. It was pretty simple. And you are also working a thumb gusset in the middle of the mitten here. And the thumb gusset is worked with increases, a left lifted increase and a right lifted increase. I haven't really worked this type of increase before. I think I usually do the make one left and then make one right, but I think that these increases are more seamless and there's less gaps in between the increases there, so really happy with that. Overall, a really great pattern. Really love how it's looking so far, and I just have the thumb to work and then the other mitten, and then I can gift these away. We have a lot of snow right now still in Toronto, so I'm thinking it's still going to be seasonally appropriate when I gift these to Grace, but I do need to finish them pretty quickly, otherwise she won't be able to wear them until next winter. So these are the Cloudburst Mittens. It's a great pattern, would highly recommend. My next whip is the Lulu Slipover Chunky by Petite Knit, and this is a winter knitting plan that I had for myself. I was debating between the Lulu Slipover and the Euros Slipover, and I was honestly leaning more towards the Euros Slipover because I do think that this yarn, this is Briggs & Little Regal, which is a 100% Canadian wool yarn. So it's very rustic, it's a very lofty, I think this might be woolen spun potentially. I don't know if I got that right, but I think based off of how it feels, especially knitted up, I think it's like a woolen spun yarn. So I did think that this yarn was going to work really well for the Euros Slipover with the cables and the construction, but I just felt like this yarn was a little bit too dark, this charcoal color. You just wouldn't really be able to see the cable pattern very well. It's like a charcoal with some light heathering in it, so I just thought it wasn't going to work that well with the texture in the Euros Slipover, so I went with the Lulu Slipover Chunky. And this is how much I have so far. So the Lulu Slipover is, I believe it's knit on 5mm needles with a worsted weight yarn. And I sized down to 4.5mm needles to achieve gauge. And it's a slipover that's worked top down. And I guess the entire thing, except for the turtleneck is worked flat. So you work the back panel here. You have a few increases here to shape the shoulder here and create a little bit of a back seam, and then you're working the slip over flat before you do some increases here to shape the armhole increases. So I am knitting this slip over in a size small, which is a size up than what I normally knit in petite knit patterns, but I did really like the look of the Lulu slipovers that have a little bit more ease, and they're worn on top of like chunkier blouses and sweaters. So I wanted this to be a little bit more relaxed. So yes, knitting the size small, and I think halfway through the last portion of increases before you just work the back panel flat. And I know that I want to crop this slip over, so I like watching Orsa Makes here on YouTube, and I saw that she had shortened the body of her Lulu slipover when she made it, I think in the summertime, and she cropped it by shortening, I believe, that part of the Lulu slipover for the body where it's just knit flat. So I think I'm going to do the same thing. I just haven't reached that point yet. So I have the back panel to work, and then the front panel. I know that this slipover has a ton of 1x1 rib to do at the end, so I am preparing myself for that, but I'm really happy with how it looks so far. I think it looks really nice in the heathered charcoal gray, and yeah, really happy with casting on another winter knitting plan. So that's where I am at with the Lulu slipover chunky. And then my last whip is a super quick update because it's my Marie pillow. I made quite a bit of progress on this pillow, so I would say I'm about 60% done now, I want to say. So here I am with the pillow, just a little accountability check-in for myself. But yeah, I am making progress on the pillow. I did realize that I messed up one of the slip stitches like quite a few centimeters down, and I didn't really know how to tink back this garter slip stitch. So what I ended up doing is I just took some of the cream yarn here, I cut off a little bit, and then I just wrapped it around the stitch that I ended up messing up. So it's just here on the inside, but that's kind of how I fixed my mistake with the Marie pillow. But yes, here I am with the Marie pillow. Not a lot of updates, but I think about 60% of the way there. And then the last thing I wanted to chat about in the podcast episode is a frogged whip that I had. So I was working on the Wave Sweater, which is a pattern by Spectacle Streak. I casted it on last winter, I think January 2024, and then it got to the summer and I was like, I can't be working on this worsted weight mohair really heavy colorwork sweater. So I just put it aside and I said I would pick it up again this winter, and now is the time to pick it up, and I just hated it. I really hated it. I just totally fell out of love with the pattern, the way that it fits, the motif. So I have mentioned in a few podcast episodes back that I had a lot of trouble with this pattern, and I have received probably like a dozen messages from people on Instagram also having trouble and asking for assistance with how to work the color work motif in the pattern. It's just not really well written, and I think that there's some mistakes in the pattern as well. So I think that also contributed to me not enjoying the pattern. Like, just staring at the pattern, I was annoyed by how the pattern was written. I also think that the motif was really fun, and it was really exciting because there was a wave knit along last winter. So I think I kind of got caught up in that, but then when I looked at it now, I just don't really know if I love the graphic wave look that much. I wasn't sure if I was really going to wear it, and I also just didn't like the fit. So the Wave Sweater has a pretty deep raglan, and I sized up the needle size, and I'm pretty sure I did it for gauge, but it also would have created a slightly more oversized sweater as well, because I couldn't achieve gauge, I think, with the 4.5 millimeter needles that the pattern calls for. So the raglan increases went really deep in the underarm, and I didn't really like how long the sweater was going to turn out anyway, so I was thinking I'd crop the body, but then I thought it would kind of give like a bit of a bat wing look because the sleeves and the raglan increase was so deep, but I didn't want the body to be that long. So I just didn't even like the fit anymore, but I just really didn't want to frog it because I had spent so much time on the color work already. I put so much time into it. I was holding like multiple yarns for the project as well, but ultimately I knew at the end of the day I needed to frog it. So that was kind of my reasoning for frogging the wave sweater. I do think it's a really cool sweater, but maybe just not for me. So that's kind of why I frogged it, and I have the yarn here. So I wanted to mention like how I frog the yarn too, because I did get some messages on Instagram on how I frog the yarn, and I don't think this is the perfect method, but it has been very effective for all the sweaters that I frogged in the past. So I would say that if you're frogging a sweater with a strand of mohair, I would say try to separate the mohair from the other strand that you're holding it with if you can. I think it makes a lot easier to re-knit, because I don't really know why, but I find that whenever I re-knit a yarn held double, like if I have a wool and a mohair, there's always a lot of slack with the heavier weight wool than with the mohair. So it's just not a really great experience re-knitting. So I just find it easier to pull apart the mohair from that main strand if you can as you're frogging. So that's kind of what I've done. Oh, I don't have it here, but that's kind of what I did with the blue portion of the wave sweater. I separated the mohair, which is a Knit Picks Aloft, from the Originally Lovely fluff, which is a blown yarn. It was pretty simple to unravel or unpick from each other, which isn't always the case, but pretty straightforward with those two yarns. So those are in two separate frogged balls. And then in terms of the main strand that I held, which was Lion Brand Fisherman's Wool, this was my main yarn, and it was very ramen noodly. So I just wound it first into a ball, but then I knew that I needed to soak the yarn to get it to be in a state where I could re-knit it again. So how I do that is I just, as I am unraveling, I just want to make sure that none of the yarns get tangled together. So I just wind them into separate, pretty tight balls. And then I take that ball and then I wrap it around, my office chair, because I know that that's like the rough size of a hank. I know people wrap them around their Swifts, and it's a little bit faster because you can spin the Swift. But my Swift is it's homemade, so it doesn't work as well, I would say, as like an umbrella Swift. So I just use my office chair, and I think what's really key to get this yarn to not tangle as you're soaking it in the water again is you use a contrasting color yarn, and while it's still wrapped either around your Swift or in my case like my office chair, I tie this yarn around the hank in a few places. And you have to, or you don't have to, but you should use a contrasting color yarn. So this is the leftovers from my Clematis sweater. It's this bright red, but I recommend using a contrasting color so it's easier to see, because one time I used to not use any sort of ties around the hank, and I just totally messed up how the hank like should be formed like this, and it just got totally tangled in the wash, and I couldn't save the yarn. It was just totally all messed up in each other because I didn't know where the loop should start and form. Then I did it again, but I used the same color yarn to wrap these little loops, and that wasn't also the wisest decision because, again, when I put it in the water, I couldn't really tell how the loop was supposed to look, and I think that's really key to not get it to tangle on itself. You need to keep the loop in the loop shape like this in the water. So if you use another color like this, and one thing that I do is I tie the yarn together here. So these are the two ends of the yarn. I tie it together once, just a simple tie, and then I wrap the other color yarn here around that, and then I tie it, and then I tie the ties again at the top. I don't know if you can kind of see, but they kind of like twist and wrap on themselves, and so that keeps this yarn in a position here where I can unwrap it and then easily just start winding it again into a ball. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing, but those are kind of my tips for how to frog and wash the yarn so you can use it again. And now it is definitely in a much smoother state to be knit again into a project. And I think the next project that I want to knit with this yarn, I already have something in mind because I don't have to start it right now, but I do really want to because I I'm really excited by it. It's a new release. I'm thinking of knitting the Key cardigan by Petite knit. So I was thinking of using the yarn that I had in the past for this project because I did really like the color combinations together. So I would use the brown for the main color of the Key cardigan, and then I'd use the Originally Lovely Fluff and Knit Picks Aloft, this cobalt blue, together for the motif. But I don't know if the blown yarn is going to look the best in the motif. I don't know if it's going to blur the pattern. And I think that that's kind of the main part of the key pattern. So I kind of want it to be pretty defined. So I'm going to do a gauge swatch with these two. And I think if the colors here, or if this yarn here doesn't really show the colorwork motif very well, I was thinking another option could be the Isire Jensen together. The Isire Jensen is a worsted weight yarn, but I don't know if these colors together are like too dark. I know there's the color work tip to make the to take a photo and turn it into black and white, and there's not a lot of contrast between these two yarns, I would say, but I think that it looks kind of cool potentially. So yeah, I'm not really sure. Let me know what you think down below. If you think that this isn't enough contrast and it wouldn't look very good, and then maybe I can find like another yarn with the Aloft, or maybe the fluff on its own. I don't know. But I want to do a brown and blue sweater. I just haven't really decided yet, but those are my plans for this sweater, and those are my reasonings for frogging the wave sweater. If you are working on a wave sweater right now and you also don't love it, just frog it. I would say just frog it. I am kind of over that pattern and that design. I do like Spectacle Streaks designs. I've knit a few of her designs before in the past that I haven't really had a problem with, but I definitely don't think I would knit another colorwork design from her in the future. So that was everything for this podcast episode. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much if you reached this point in the video. I will continue working away on some of my whips, and I will figure out what to do with my key sweater, but if you could let me know down below if you have any ideas for the color combinations, that would be much appreciated. So until I see you in my next video, happy knitting!